There is a moment that arrives without announcement, somewhere between the 100th effort and the 101st, when the body is still present, still technically moving through the motions, but something deeper has quietly begun negotiating an exit. Most people never notice this negotiation while it is happening. They only notice the result, the task postponed, the discipline that was steady yesterday somehow absent today, the quiet sense of having let something slip that cannot quite be named. And in that moment, a thought arrives that feels like wisdom. Enough. It feels like honesty, like the mature recognition of human limitation, like the reasonable conclusion of someone who has simply given what could be given and has nothing left to offer. But here is what almost no one examines in that exact moment. Is what feels like enough actually enough? Or is it the mind, exhausted in seeking relief, dressing avoidance in the language of wisdom? These two things can feel identical from the inside. Genuine rest and quiet surrender wear almost the same face when the mind is tired enough. And that is precisely why tiredness is one of the most consequential thresholds a person will ever stand at. Not because fatigue is shameful. It is not. Not because rest is weakness. It never was. But because the decisions made at the edge of exhaustion, made quietly, without examination, often carry far more weight than the decisions made in moments of clarity and energy. Legacy, in the Stoic understanding of what that word actually means, is not built on the days when everything flows easily. It is not assembled during the seasons when motivation arrives without being summoned. It is built in precisely this moment, at the threshold of exhaustion, in the choice made when the mind is already looking for a reason to stop. Today we are going to look closely at what tiredness is actually asking of you, not as an obstacle between you and who you are trying to become, but as the precise condition under which character either reveals itself or quietly disappears. Something shifts inside the mind when exhaustion reaches a certain depth. And the shift is not dramatic. It does not arrive with the clarity of a conscious decision. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, in the way priorities rearrange themselves without ever asking permission. The task that mattered this morning still matters objectively. Nothing about its importance has actually changed. But the mind that was willing to carry it hours ago is no longer the same mind sitting here now. And the difference between those two minds is not character. It is neurological. Here is the mechanism worth understanding clearly. The brain does not maintain an infinite reservoir of decision-making capacity. Every choice made throughout the day, every moment of sustained attention, every small act of self-regulation draws from the same finite pool. As that pool depletes, something researchers have called decision fatigue begins to operate. And what it does is precise. It does not eliminate the ability to choose. It systematically shifts preference toward whichever option requires the least immediate effort. This means that by the time genuine exhaustion arrives, the mind is not choosing rest because rest is what is actually needed. It is choosing rest because rest requires less from it than continuing does. And the critical distinction between those two things, between genuine recovery and the path of least resistance, is almost impossible to feel from the inside when the mind is already depleted. Here is where human nature adds its own particular complication. The exhausted mind does not simply choose the easier path. It constructs a justification for that choice that sounds like wisdom. I have done enough today. Rest is productive. pushing through fatigue is harmful. The wisest people know their limits. Every one of these statements can be true, and every one of them can also be the mind rationalizing avoidance. The exhausted brain is remarkably skilled at making withdrawals sound like self-awareness. And this is not a moral failing. It is simply what a mind under sustained cognitive load tends to do when the resources required for honest self-examination are exactly the resources that have already been spent. Consider what this looks like across ordinary life. Someone works through a demanding day, completes what was required, and arrives at the evening facing one more task, something important, something that aligns with a longer vision they genuinely hold. And the mind immediately begins its negotiation. Tomorrow will be better. One night will not matter. Rest now and return to it fresh. Sometimes this is accurate, but watch closely how often tomorrow arrives carrying the same negotiation, and the night after, until the pattern that felt like wisdom reveals itself as something that has been quietly accumulating into a way of life. Someone is building something slowly, a discipline, a practice, a skill that requires consistent attention over a long period of time. And late in the evening, when the emotional reserves are already low, the mind offers its familiar bargain. You have earned this pause. The problem is not the pause itself. The problem is that the pause has become the default response to difficulty rather than a considered choice made with genuine awareness. A parent moves through the sustained invisible labor of that particular season of life and reaches a moment where everything feels like too much simultaneously. The mind lands on its conclusion quickly. I cannot do this anymore. But look carefully at what that sentence is actually claiming. Not that rest is needed, but that continuation itself has become impossible. And the distance between those two things, between needing to pause and believing the entire endeavor is beyond what can be carried, is enormous. And it is almost always the fatigue constructing that distance, not reality. The tiredness is real in every one of these moments. Nothing here suggests otherwise, but the story the tired mind builds around the tiredness, the verdict it delivers about what the fatigue means and what it permits, is where the most consequential damage quietly occurs, not in the exhaustion itself, but in how the exhaustion gets read. Look carefully at what actually happens inside the mind the moment exhaustion reaches its threshold. Not the feeling of it, which everyone recognizes, but the specific sequence of events that follows the feeling. Because
that sequence, unexamined, is where the most consequential decisions of a person's life quietly get made. The first thing worth understanding clearly is that fatigue does not attack character directly. It attacks something more specific: the mental resource required to examine your own motivations honestly. Self-regulation, the capacity to observe your own impulses and choose a response that aligns with what you actually value rather than what offers immediate relief, draws from the same cognitive pool as every other demanding mental activity. By the time genuine exhaustion arrives, that pool is already significantly depleted, which means the very faculty you would need to examine whether stopping is wisdom or avoidance is precisely the faculty that is no longer fully available. This creates a specific and underappreciated vulnerability. The exhausted mind is making decisions about its own limits using a diminished version of the tool required to make those decisions accurately. Think about what this means in practice. The person who decides at 11 in the evening that they are simply not capable of the discipline they maintained for the previous 6 months is making that assessment with a mind that has already spent most of its capacity for honest self-evaluation. The conclusion feels accurate. It arrives with complete conviction. But it is being generated by a system operating at reduced capacity. And reduced capacity systems consistently overestimate how permanent their current state actually is. Human nature adds a second layer to this that deserves careful attention. People consistently conflate the experience of effort with evidence about the limits of their capability. When something feels hard, the mind tends to interpret that difficulty as proximity to a genuine ceiling, rather than as the ordinary texture of doing something that matters under conditions that are less than ideal. But effort and limitation are not the same thing. The feeling of strain does not reliably indicate that a genuine boundary has been reached. More often it indicates that the work being done is real, that it is asking something genuine of the person attempting it, and that the resistance arising is the resistance of meaningful engagement, not the signal of approaching collapse. The mind under fatigue rarely makes this distinction clearly. Instead, it reaches for what researchers studying cognitive load have observed consistently. When mental resources are depleted, the brain seeks to simplify. And simplification in this context means collapsing the distinction between this is difficult and this is beyond me into a single conclusion. One that permits withdrawal without requiring any further examination. And then the emotional layer arrives. Because exhaustion rarely travels alone. Shame surfaces quietly. The sense that being this tired reveals something inadequate. That someone with more genuine capability would not be feeling this particular strain at this particular point. And shame in the exhausted mind does not motivate. It accelerates withdrawal,
providing a second and deeper justification for stopping that feels less like avoidance and more like honest self-knowledge. Self-doubt joins next, whispering that the entire direction was perhaps mistaken from the beginning. That the tiredness is not incidental to the endeavor but evidence about whether the endeavor itself was ever realistic. And fear of the future arrives last, projecting the current state of depletion forward indefinitely. If I feel this way now, after this much effort, what does the path ahead actually look like? When these three forces move together, shame, self-doubt, and a fear-based projection of current limits into a permanent future, the exhausted mind stops processing what is actually true about its situation and begins constructing a narrative that feels like realism but functions like surrender. The tiredness is real, but the story built around the tiredness is almost always considerably larger than the tiredness itself. And it is in that gap, between what the fatigue actually is and what the exhausted mind concludes it means, that the most consequential decisions quietly get made. Marcus Aurelius did not write about discipline from a position of abundant energy. His private journals reveal a man who explicitly struggled to rise in the mornings, who recorded his own resistance to the demands of the day with a candor that is striking precisely because he was writing for no audience but himself. He was not performing Stoic resolve. He was working to locate it, in real time, against genuine reluctance. And what he returned to again and again was not the question of whether he felt ready, but whether what he was about to do aligned with reason, with virtue, with the standard he had set for how a life worth living actually gets constructed. This is the distinction worth carrying carefully into the moments when exhaustion is loudest. The question is never whether you feel capable. The question is whether the action aligns with who you have decided to be. These two questions look similar from a distance, but they lead in entirely different directions. The first question asks the feeling to serve as authority. And exhausted feelings are unreliable authorities. They speak loudly, with great conviction, but they are generated by a system operating under conditions that systematically distort judgment. The second question asks something that fatigue cannot answer on its own. It asks character. Epictetus drew a boundary that deserves precise attention here. Not as abstract philosophy, but as a practical tool for exactly the moment being described. He separated what lies within our control from what does not. And fatigue itself falls clearly into the second category. The body will tire. The mind will deplete. The resources required for sustained effort will fluctuate in ways that no amount of intention can entirely prevent. These are not failures. They are simply the conditions of being human. What remains within control, always, regardless of how depleted the current state feels, is the response
chosen in response to that depletion. This is not a call to ignore genuine exhaustion. Epictetus was not describing a philosophy of relentless output that treats the body as irrelevant. He was describing something more precise. The recognition that between the feeling of fatigue and the decision about what to do with that feeling, there is always a space. And inside that space, something that belongs entirely to you, something the fatigue cannot reach, still has the capacity to choose. Seneca approached the relationship between hardship and character from an angle that reframes the entire experience of being tested by exhaustion. He observed that difficulty does not create the qualities it appears to produce in those who endure it. It reveals qualities that were already present, waiting for conditions demanding enough to make them visible. What this means for the exhausted person standing at the threshold of giving up is genuinely significant. The fatigue is not an interruption to the process of building character. It is the process. The discipline that holds when energy is plentiful is not the discipline that builds anything lasting. That particular discipline is relatively easy to maintain. It asks very little of the person practicing it. The discipline that matters. The discipline that Seneca pointed toward when he wrote about the relationship between adversity and genuine strength, is the discipline that persists when the mind is actively generating sophisticated reasons to stop. Taken together, these three perspectives converge on a single understanding that the exhausted mind most needs and is least equipped to locate on its own. Marcus Aurelius points toward the question that fatigue cannot answer. Not whether you feel ready, but whether this aligns with who you have decided to be. Epictetus draws the boundary between what the fatigue controls and what it does not. The response, that space between feeling and decision, always remains yours. And Seneca reframes the entire experience. The threshold of exhaustion is not the place where the work of character ends. It is the place where the work of character actually begins. There are moments when you notice a particular thought beginning to surface. I'll do it tomorrow. Just this once. I'm too drained right now. That thought doesn't arrive loudly. It slides in quietly, almost gently. And it knows exactly when to come. Pay attention to the timing. Is it midday when the morning's energy has already been spent? Is it late at night when the day has pressed everything out of you? Or does it arrive right after a conversation that left you emotionally hollowed out? These are not random moments. They are patterns. And patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. The practice here is not to fight the thought the moment it arrives. It is to pause long enough to ask one honest question. Am I genuinely at my limit right now? Or am I looking for a reason to step away from what this moment is asking of me? That question is not an accusation. It is a mirror. And what it shows you matters far more than any answer you could give in a hurry. Because fatigue is not one thing. It wears different faces. There is the fatigue that lives in your body, the kind that comes from physical depletion, from not enough sleep or not enough food or simply from carrying weight for too long. There is the fatigue that lives in the mind, from making too many decisions, from holding too many thoughts at once, from trying to solve something that has no clean solution. And then there is the fatigue that lives deeper still, in the emotional layer, where disappointment and loneliness and self-doubt have quietly accumulated over days or weeks without ever being named. Each of these calls for something different, and when you try to respond to one without knowing which it is, you will almost always choose the wrong direction, not because you are weak, but because you were moving without clarity. The awareness itself, the simple act of stopping to ask which kind of tired this is already a form of discipline. It is already the beginning of something the untrained mind rarely does. There is a difference between a mind that is resting and a mind that is retreating, and in the moments when exhaustion is loudest, that difference becomes the most important distinction you can learn to make. Because the tired mind is not a reliable guide. It will frame retreat as wisdom. It will dress avoidance in the language of self-care. It will make the path of least resistance feel not just acceptable, but earned. And that is precisely when the boundary matters most. When the mind is depleted, the inputs you allow into that space carry more weight than usual. The endless scrolling that feels harmless. The comparisons that surface quietly while you move through other people's curated lives. The noise that asks nothing of you but takes something from you nonetheless. These do not restore a tired mind. They fragment it further. They scatter what little coherence remains. And they leave you more depleted than you were before. Not because any single moment of distraction is catastrophic, but because a tired mind absorbs everything more deeply. And what it absorbs shapes the story it begins to tell about itself. So the boundary being described here is not a rigid wall built against the world. It is a quiet and deliberate act of protection. Choosing what enters the space of a depleted mind is not indulgence. It is stewardship. It is the recognition that the mind recovering from genuine effort deserves conditions that support recovery, not conditions that accelerate erosion. But here is where the boundary must be drawn with honesty. Rest and avoidance are not the same thing. They can feel identical from the inside. Both involve stepping back. Both involve a reduction of effort. But they move in opposite directions. Rest returns you to yourself. Avoidance moves you away from the person you have decided to become. Rest is what happens when you have given genuinely and need to recover genuinely. Avoidance is what happens when the work became uncomfortable and the discomfort was mistaken for a signal to stop. One is an act of care. The other is a quiet form of self-abandonment. And the honest mind, even the exhausted honest mind, usually knows which one it is choosing. This is where emotional discipline enters, not as severity, not as the refusal to acknowledge what is real, but as the capacity to hold a small commitment even inside a difficult day. It does not require that the commitment be large. It does not require that you perform at the level you could reach on your best day. It requires only that something be kept. One thing. however small. That was not surrendered simply because the day made surrendering feel reasonable. Because discipline sustained across difficult days is not built from grand gestures. It is built from the accumulation of small choices that were made when making them cost something. And those choices, repeated quietly over time, become the person you are. I am tired. That statement is true, and it deserves to be acknowledged as true. But there is a second sentence that belongs beside it, one that the exhausted mind tends to leave unspoken. And my tiredness does not decide what I am worth, or what I am capable of choosing in this moment. These two sentences held together, not in opposition, but in honest coexistence, change the entire architecture of how fatigue is experienced. The first sentence without the second becomes a conclusion. The second sentence without the first becomes denial. But together, they become something closer to clarity. This is not a script designed to trick the mind into feeling something it does not feel. It is a correction, a quiet and deliberate correction of the story that exhaustion tends to write on its own when left unexamined. Because the mind under fatigue is a storyteller. And the stories it tells are not neutral. They contract around the evidence that confirms how difficult everything is. And they quietly exclude the evidence of everything that has been held together despite that difficulty. The internal dialogue being described here is simply the practice of returning the excluded evidence to the picture. Not to manufacture optimism, but to see accurately. There is another sentence worth carrying into the days when the weight of accumulated effort makes legacy feel like an abstraction too distant to matter. What I am building right now is not being built in the moments of victory. It is being built in this moment. In the choice I make when choosing the easier thing would cost me nothing in anyone else's eyes, but would cost me something in my own. That sentence is not motivational in the conventional sense. It does not ask you to feel inspired. It asks you to remember what you already know about how character is actually constructed. Not in the visible moments, but in the private ones. The ones where no one is watching. And the choice still gets made. And then there is the practice that asks the least and reveals the most. At the end of the day, when the tiredness has settled into the body and the mind has grown quiet, ask one question. What did I not surrender today? Even though I was tired. Not what did you achieve. Not what did you accomplish by any external measure. But what principle? What commitment? What small thread of the person you are becoming? Did you hold on to when letting go would have been so much easier? Write it down if you can. Even a single line. Because what gets named gets seen. And what gets seen becomes real in a way that shapeless effort never quite does. Over time, that record becomes something more than a journal. It becomes evidence. Evidence that on the days when everything in you wanted to stop, something in you chose not to. And that something, quiet and unglamorous as it is exactly what legacy is made of. Something shifts when a person stops waiting to feel ready before they act with integrity. It is not a dramatic shift. It does not announce itself. But it is real. And once it happens, the relationship between exhaustion and identity changes in a way that cannot easily be undone. There was a version of you that treated tiredness as a verdict. A signal that the self had reached its true boundary. That what lay beyond the feeling of depletion was territory that did not belong to you. That version of you was not wrong to feel what it felt. It was simply reading the feeling with a set of assumptions that had never been examined. And unexamined assumptions have a way of quietly governing everything. The person who emerges from the practice described in these pages is not someone who no longer gets tired. Tiredness does not disappear. The body still depletes. The mind still reaches the edges of what it can hold with clarity. The emotional reserves still run low after days that ask more than they return. None of that changes. What changes is the meaning assigned to those experiences.
And meaning, as it turns out, is not a passive thing that arrives from the outside. It is something the mind constructs, and a mind that has been trained to construct meaning carefully constructs it differently than a mind that has never been asked to. Where exhaustion once produced panic, there is now something quieter. Not indifference, not the absence of feeling, but a kind of steadiness that can hold the feeling without being swept into it. The tiredness is read the way a navigator reads weather, as information, as data about current conditions, not as a judgment about the destination, or about whether the journey was worth beginning. This is what emotional maturity actually looks like when it is lived rather than described. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is the capacity to remain oriented inside the difficulty, to know where you are going even when the conditions make going harder. And beneath all of this, beneath the practice and the awareness and the small daily choices that compound over time into something recognizable as character, there is a freedom that emerges. Not the freedom from circumstance. Circumstance will always do what circumstance does. But the freedom that comes from discovering that the external conditions of a day, however difficult, do not have final authority over the internal direction of the person moving through that day. That discovery, quiet as it tends to be, is one of the most significant a person can make, because it relocates the source of stability from out there, where nothing is guaranteed, to in here, where something, practiced and chosen and returned to again and again, has been built to last. And on the days when everything outside feels uncertain, that inner ground, earned through the unglamorous work of holding principle inside exhaustion, becomes the most reliable thing you have. Legacy is not what gets built on the days when everything is working. It is not assembled in the moments of clarity and energy and forward momentum when effort feels almost effortless. Those days matter, but they do not ask very much of the person living them. What asks something real, what reaches into the actual substance of who a person is, are the days when the energy is gone and the reasons to stop are plentiful and the path of least resistance is so close it can almost be felt. And on those days, in those moments, something small and quiet is either kept or surrendered. And that keeping, or that surrendering, repeated across enough days, becomes the answer to the question of what kind of person was actually being built all along. So when the tiredness comes, and it will come, the question worth sitting with is not, how do I make this feeling stop? It is something quieter and more honest than that. Is what I am about to do a return to myself, or a slow movement away from the person I have decided to become? That question does not demand a perfect answer. It demands an honest one. And the honest answer, whatever it turns out to be, is always worth more than the comfortable one. If something in this journey has met you where you actually are, not where it is easier to pretend to be, then carry it forward quietly, not as a performance, not as an identity to display, but as a private standard, one that exists between you and the choices you make when no one is watching. Stay calm, stay wise, and keep living your truth.